Hey everybody, Charles for HumbleMechanic.com. Today we're going to be talking about the top 5 or so failures of the Volkswagen Touareg. So the Volkswagen Touareg and I have a long history together. It is the vehicle that came out right when I started working on Volkswagen, so it's kind of the car that I learned how to fix Volkswagens on, which honestly was a great thing for me. So I know a lot of my fellow technicians really hate the Touareg, especially that very early generation, but for me, we have a long history, and I'm actually really excited to talk about these failures today. But before we get into the show, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is Deutsche Auto Parts. These guys are the Volkswagen Audi parts experts. Awesome service, incredible pricing, a ton of really great DIY videos. So check them out at shopdap.com. All right, so the very first failure I'm going to talk about today is the tire pressure monitoring system. This system was an absolute nightmare. There was a customer interface and you had to reset it every time you rotated the tires. What ended up happening is you do a service like an oil change and rotate and then spend like 30 minutes driving the damn car in order to get the light to not say learn mode. And that was as long as there was plenty of battery life left, because these batteries were only rated for like 90 months, but they never lasted that long. Anything under like 25 months, the tire pressures would start to get squirrely. There was update after coating change, and then the Phaeton was kind of a problem too. So, you know, it was Volkswagen's first, between the Touareg and the Phaeton, it was their first tire pressure monitoring system they had ever had. So technicians didn't know how to diagnose it. Customers weren't used to it. We also got a number of calls with people complaining, hey, my light's on. They'd bring it in, tire pressure would be good. We'd drive it for 2 days. The light would never go out. We'd call Volkswagen. And this was back when Techline was a whole different ballgame than it is today. If any of you guys from Techline are watching, thank you for the great job you've done in the last like 4 or 5 years. It's so much better than it used to be. But, you know, that was just a little side note to the folks at Techline. It was a nightmare back then. You had to call and describe your problem. And if you got somebody new on a second call, you had to go through it all over again. Terrible. So we would spend days and days trying to figure out these stupid tire pressure monitors, all to find out that, you know, it needed a coating change, or, you know, like I said, the battery life was too low. A nightmare. One of the most hectic things that I had ever dealt with on the Touareg. Following right along with tire pressure monitors, number 2 is tires themselves. These vehicles would go through tires like crazy. It was not uncommon to see a Touareg at 10,000 miles need 2 tires. And it wasn't just that they were worn odd, they were just straight worn out. The Touareg's a big, heavy vehicle, and part of me feels like this probably didn't have the appropriate tires on it right off the factory floor. So we would be replacing tires at 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 miles. Back then in 04, 05, if you got 20,000 miles out of your Touareg tires, it was a freaking miracle. I know we put a ton of tires on under warranty or some kind of goodwill because customers, and rightfully so, were like, hey, this car's only got 10,000 miles. Why am I having to buy $400 worth of tires? Because, you know, these were the 19-inch tires, so the tires were gigantic by Volkswagen standard anyway. So we were putting tires on all the time, which goes back to the tire pressure monitors, because the tire pressure monitors would be broken a lot. A lot of technicians would just jam the arm into the tire and pop the sensor, and then now we're having to put tires on and having to replace tire pressure monitors. In addition to all that, guys also really struggled with the alignments on these vehicles. The technician that was hired at my dealership right before me was a Volkswagen master tech. He was one of, you know, the greatest technicians in the world, whatever he said he was. And he took a day and a half to align the first air ride Touareg that he did. Me, not knowing any better, I followed the repair manual and did it in about 2 hours. And that was one of like the first 25 alignments that I'd ever done. So it was a whole disaster with the entire wheel and tire package. Number 3 is everyone's favorite, and that is electrical problems. I remember having so many electrical problems with these Touaregs. I think I've blocked out a lot of what the exact problems were, but one of the main things was the vehicle battery system. So this was primarily a V8 issue. There was a jump start terminal underneath the hood, and then a cable that ran down and behind the engine to the starter and to the alternator. Well, what was happening is these cables would develop a volt drop, so the charging voltage would be roughly a volt lower than it was supposed to be. And this would make the electronics go nuts. Things flashing in the dash, things flashing in the center console, radio's not working, air conditioning's not working, all kinds of nutso stuff because we were 1 volt low. It would start by cutting out the non-critical systems, then eventually get to the critical systems as the vehicle voltage dropped lower and lower and lower. I remember the very first one that I got paid to remove and install the engine, and eventually they figured out that we didn't need to do that. Then it became a campaign, then it became a recall, and pretty soon that time was down to about 3.5 hours, which still, you know, I had perfected my method of doing it, but 3.5 hours was a lot less time, obviously, than R&R, the engine and transmission. But we had access start module system problems like the KESI, the keyless entry system, airbag connectors under the seats, just like the Mark V Jettas and B6 Passats. Current draw issues from the driver's seat module. I went round and round for like a week trying to isolate this current draw / the vehicle was doing weird stuff. Essentially what was happening is the CAN bus system was being brought down by the driver's seat module being bad. So that was a nightmare. That was probably one of the most butt-kicking times I've ever had on any vehicle in my career. Even weird stuff to the point where if you had a brake light that sometimes was out, it would cause your vehicle to hesitate under load. So weird, really weird electrical problems. Number 4 is the prop shaft. Now, the prop shaft connects the transfer case to the rear differential, so that's one of the main components of allowing you to have 4-wheel drive, or as Volkswagen calls it, 4X motion. So in the middle of that prop shaft, there was a bearing. And what would happen over time is the rubber that held the bearing to the cage of the bearing would deteriorate and come loose. And it sounded like someone was underneath the car banging it with a hammer as you drove through a parking lot. And the V6s had the most issue. Eventually what started happening is the V8s drive shaft got put in the VR6 so that it was a little bit beefier of a drive shaft, but even the V8s had a problem, and actually we still see this from time to time on some of the newer generations as well. And number 5, and this is really where a lot of the issues I think came from, is customers didn't know how to use the car and technicians didn't know what the hell to do with it. From a technician standpoint, this was all very new. This is technology that started a little bit like a sprinkle in the W8 Passat, but then just, man, full punch to the face in the Touareg and the Phaeton. There was so much different coming from the Mark IV and the B5 to the Touareg, to the Phaeton, that technicians didn't know how to do a lot of this stuff. And the information wasn't great. I mean, on the Touareg, this is the information that came out. Now, while 4 books on one vehicle sounds like a lot, there was so much more to this vehicle than you could ever cover in 4 repair books. And customers didn't know how to use these systems. They didn't understand the tire pressure monitor, or the radio system, or the climate control, or what the vehicle was doing. If a customer brought their vehicle in with 20 concerns, which was really common at the time, 5 of them generally would be legit. 5 of them would be required vehicle updates or things we could duplicate and fix, and then 10 of them would be things that were all functioning normally, but the customer just didn't understand it. They would call them phantom issues or non-issues. And it was frustrating because you as a technician would go through and try and duplicate all this stuff, all to call Volkswagen or talk to your tech next to you, and they go, oh man, that's normal. Don't even worry about it. So that was one of really the big thing that sort of spiraled out of control a lot of these issues on the Touareg, is just because technicians didn't know how to fix it, customers didn't understand it, salespeople didn't do a great job explaining to the customer how these things worked, and on top of it, the car had a lot of problems. All right, so number 6, and this is more of a new generation issue than an older generation issue, and that's Ad-Blue heater system problems. This is exclusive to the 3-liter Touareg, the newest generation, which honestly, after about 06, the Touareg has been a pretty dang good vehicle. But the Ad-Blue heater on the newer generation diesels has become sort of not a huge issue, but enough that it's recognizable when the check engine light's on. We have had to replace a few NOx sensors over the years, just for faults randomly here and there, but not nearly at the level of 1, all that other stuff we just talked about, and 2, the heater system for the Ad-Blue. All right, so that's the top 6. Now you guys know what it's time for. It is time for the rapid fire problems. A lot like tire wear, we had really significant brake wear. Again, 15, 20,000 miles, not uncommon for Touareg to need pads, rotors, and sensors. And let me tell you about brakes that aren't cheap. Touareg brakes aren't cheap. There was a required vehicle update to lengthen the antenna because the remote key fob distance was too short. Sometimes you would have to be right on top of the car mashing the button in order for it to unlock. The V6 Touareg had issues with timing chains. There were updates, software updates like you would not believe. It makes the number of updates that we do today seem minor compared to what we were doing on the Touaregs. There was a required vehicle update for something with the rear glass where we would have to replace a cover. I don't exactly remember, but I remember taking a lot of rear panels off on the Touareg. There was also an update to remove a tiny little piece of rubber that held in place the power steering cooler lines. We added brackets to the rear seat belts because I think they were actually just a little bit too long. The rear seats would get stuck. They would get stuck and you wouldn't be able to raise it all the way up, and then you'd have to unbolt the seat belt just to raise the seat up. And of course what that did was broke the retainer for the center seat belt. We had issues with fuel pumps. I've put a handful of fuel pumps. In fact, one of my most miserable experiences as a technician is working on a Touareg, putting 2 fuel pumps in it when it was below 30 degrees, and let me tell you, cold fuel really hurts your hands. We had ignition coil issues on the V6 and the V8. Both of them were covered under the recall. Now we're seeing a fair amount of brake booster piping cracking. The air ride pumps would go out. There was actually a required vehicle update to rebuild the air pump on the air ride Touaregs. And one of the other really common things is a splice that gets all weird and generally corroded due to water intrusion right underneath where the driver's feet go. And that wasn't always a sunroof issue. All right, guys, there you have it. That is probably the top, 30 failures of the Volkswagen Touareg. We focused a lot on the early generation because actually that's where a lot of the failures really did occur. As the generations went on, as the years went on, the Touaregs did get quite a bit better. I'm sure we could throw in things like headlight bulbs, tail light bulbs, technicians busting tail lights when they were trying to take them out because they would put the bone trim tool and it would separate the inner piece from the outer housing piece. Seen a lot of broken tail lights in my day. All right, guys, I'm gonna wrap it up there. If you have any questions, comments, or failures that I missed on the Touareg, post it in the comments section below. Hey, if you liked the video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I do always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at humblemechanic.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the blog, and obviously right here on YouTube. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. And the drink of the day, a hot tea bag.